The book sitting in your Bible right now is called Judges. You've probably heard sermons from it. Gideon, Deborah, Samson. You know these names. You've been told these were people who judged, people who sat on benches, ruled on cases, kept the law in order across the long and difficult gap between the time of Joshua and the rise of the kings. But there is a problem sitting quietly inside that translation. A problem that's been there for centuries, in plain sight, unremarked in most pulpits. The Hebrew word at the center of this entire book, the word translated judges, doesn't quite mean that. It carries something older, something louder, something that changes how you read every single page. And once you see it, the book never looks the same. The word is Shophet. Shophet. It comes from the root verb shapat. And yes, in certain contexts and certain books of the Hebrew Bible, shapat genuinely does mean to judge in a legal sense. The word has real judicial weight, and the tradition of using it that way goes back to the oldest texts. But in the book of Judges specifically, the book bearing this word as its very title, the primary function of the shophetim, the plural of shophet, was not about courtrooms or legal proceedings. Britannica states it plainly. The Hebrew shophet was closer in meaning to ruler, a kind of military leader, a deliverer from potential or actual defeat. Not a magistrate in a robe, a rescuer in armor. The book the ancient Jews called shophetim, the book your English Bible calls Judges, could just as accurately be called the book of rescuers. And that shift doesn't diminish the book, it opens it. Because the question the book has been asking from its first chapter to its last is not who deserves punishment, it's who will go when no one else will. To understand why this matters, you have to read the key verse slowly. It's Judges 2:16. This single sentence is the thesis of the entire book, the organizing statement laid out before any of the individual narratives begin, that tells you exactly what you're about to read for the next 18 chapters. In Hebrew, the text says, "Then the Lord raised up shophetim, who saved them out of the hands of those who plundered them." Read that carefully. God raised up shophetim, and then, immediately and without pause, the text tells you what they did. They saved the people. Not they adjudicated, not they presided, not they examined evidence and issued verdicts. They saved. The verb used for that saving is from the root yasha, rescue, deliverance, salvation. This is the very same root that gives you Yeshua, the Hebrew name translated into Greek as Jesus, the name your English Bible renders as Jesus, the name that means salvation itself. And it is yasha that describes what the shophetim did. The word translated judge is the title. The action underneath the title is always rescue. Then look at verse 18, still in the same chapter. When the Lord raised them up as shophetim, the Lord was with the Chauffet and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the Chauffet. There is the full structure. God raises up the Chauffet. The Chauffet is present and active. The people are delivered from their enemies. The Chauffet dies. The people drift back toward the patterns that brought them into trouble in the first place. Foreign oppression returns. The people cry out again. God raises up the next Chauffet. There is nothing in this cycle, not one step of it, about legal proceedings. The entire cycle is about oppression, crisis, divine response, and rescue. That is the grammar of the book. The Chauffet is the grammar's answer, not the verdict, the rescue. Now consider what the word Chauffet was doing in the ancient Near Eastern world, beyond Israel alone. The title Chauffet, or its cognate forms, appears in Carthaginian inscriptions for high magistrates called sufetes, in Phoenician records for senior civic leaders, and in Ugaritic texts from Ras Shamra predating the Israelite period. Across these cognate cultures, the term consistently refers to a figure of authority whose power is executive and sometimes military, not merely judicial. The concept of the Chauffet as someone who sets things in order, including by force when necessary, is older than any one text and broader than any one culture. When the Hebrew scriptures use this word for the leaders between Joshua and Saul, they are drawing on a recognized ancient category, the person of authority who intervenes in a crisis and restores order. The scholarly work confirms this. Yoel Halevi, examining the etymology of Chauffet across Semitic languages, argues that the title represents a charismatic chieftain whose authority, to judge and to set things in order, was not confined to the courtroom, but extended to all aspects of political and military leadership, most critically, the deliverance of the people. That phrase is worth pausing on, the deliverance of the people, not the sentencing, the deliverance. Kenneth Kitchen's work on the pre-monarchic period adds that in the absence of central government, standing armies, or permanent institutions, crisis figures emerged in response to specific threats and led precisely to address them. They rose, they delivered, they receded. Shophetim. Picture a farming village in the hill country of Manasseh. Not a metaphor, an actual place. Iron Age 1, roughly 1150 BCE. The houses are stone and mud brick. The olive trees have been there for generations. The harvest is almost ready. But the Midianites come every year at harvest time. They sweep in on camels from the eastern desert, take the grain, drive off the livestock, burn what they can't carry. 7 years of this. 7 consecutive harvests stripped to nothing. You hide your threshing down in the bottom of a winepress so they don't see you working. You've watched your family go hungry for 7 seasons in a row. And then, one afternoon, a man from your tribe gets a visit. He's threshing in the winepress too, afraid to be seen. He argues with the divine messenger who appears to him. He asks for signs twice, because once isn't enough to convince him. But the Spirit of the Lord comes on him and transforms what he is. And that transformation has a name in Hebrew: Shophet. He gathers an army. God tells him the army is too big. He sends most of them home. He goes forward with 300 men, a clay jar, and a torch, in the dark. The Midianite camp erupts in chaos. The land rests for 40 years. That is what the word Shophet describes on the ground. In the actual story, in the actual crisis it addresses. Gideon is not a judge. Gideon is a rescuer. Now let's take the honest turn, because this channel doesn't do one-sided word studies. Is it true that shapat can mean to adjudicate, to settle legal disputes, to pronounce rulings between people? Yes. Genuinely, yes. Exodus 18 is the clearest example in the Torah. Jethro watches Moses sit from morning to evening hearing cases that people bring before him, one person against another, disputes about what the statutes of God require in complex situations. The verb throughout is shapat. Moses is functioning as a legal arbitrator. The word is right for that function. And in the book of Judges itself, there are shophetim who don't fit the military deliverer pattern. The so-called minor judges, Tola, Jair, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, receive brief entries. Judged Israel for 23 years, had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys, died and was buried in such and such a place. No battle described, no enemy defeated, no angel. Scholars genuinely debate what these figures were doing. Some argue they were regional administrators maintaining stability during periods of relative peace. Some argue they adjudicated the internal disputes of their tribes, functioning as the legal authorities the English title implies. The text doesn't specify, and anyone who tells you the question is definitively settled in one direction misrepresents the state of the evidence. The minor judges are genuinely ambiguous. But this is the critical distinction. When the text actually shows you what a shophet does, when it follows the narrative rather than just recording the name and the years, the pattern is overwhelmingly one of military rescue and deliverance. The detailed narratives that give the book its drama and its theology are rescue stories, not adjudication stories. And the lexicons reflect the full range. Strong's Hebrew lexicon lists shapat's meanings as to judge, to govern, to vindicate, to punish, to defend, to deliver, to execute judgment. That list is not a collection of synonyms. It describes a family of related functions orbiting a single center, the idea of putting things right when they have gone wrong, vindicating the oppressed, defending the vulnerable, delivering the captured. Every one of those functions is a form of intervention. The Chauffet is the one who intervenes. There's also a cognate noun that helps clarify what the whole root is really about. Mishpat comes from the same root as shapat and is one of the most important words in the Hebrew Bible. It appears over 400 times and is usually translated as justice or judgment in English. But mishpat in Hebrew means something closer to the right ordering of things, the state of affairs where the vulnerable are protected, where the oppressed are liberated, where the powerful do not simply do whatever benefits them. Mishpat is the word the prophets cry out for when they accuse Israel of abandoning God. Amos, Isaiah, Micah, Mimchach, when they say God requires justice and his people have forsaken it, they are using mishpat. And they don't mean a legal procedure, they mean a condition. The condition of a society where no one is being crushed by a force stronger than them without someone intervening. The Shophet, the one who shapat, is the agent of mishpat. The rescuer is the one who produces the right order. The word family, taken together, tells you something important. Rescue and justice are not separate categories in Hebrew thought. They are the same action at different scales. Here is where the translation chain becomes its own story. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, the Septuagint, produced across the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE in Alexandria, the translators chose the Greek word kritai for shophetim. Kritai does mean judges, but in ancient Greek usage, krinein carried a broader weight, to discern, to decide authoritatively, to cut through ambiguity and restore what has broken down. The narrowing is subtle at that step. Then Jerome's Latin Vulgate renders it iudex, the word that anchors Roman legal tradition. From iudex, through centuries of Latin Christianity, into early modern English, you get judge, a word so thoroughly shaped by Western legal culture that most English readers cannot hear it without imagining a courtroom, an adversarial proceeding, a bench. Each step in the translation chain was defensible. Each step also quietly compressed the word. And by the time you open your English Bible to this book, the image that arrives is a magistrate, not a warrior, a bench, not a battle, a verdict, not a rescue dot. You are always reading a translation of a translation. The English translated the Latin translated the Greek translated the Hebrew. At each junction, a human being made a decision, chose one word from a range of possibilities, shaped by the assumptions of their moment in history, the mental images embedded in their language, the theological frameworks already in place when they sat down to translate. They weren't wrong. They were doing what translators have always done and always must do. But the original word keeps standing there, unchanged, carrying everything it has always carried. And it carries something the English word judge doesn't fully reach. Now walk through the roster of shophetim and watch the word do its work in the actual text. Othniel, the first Chauffet named in the book. Judges 3:9 introduces him as a Moshiach, a deliverer, before calling him a Shophet. 2 verses later, verse 10, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim into his hand. He was a Shophet. What that meant was, he went to war. He delivered. Ehud, Judges 3:15. The text again reaches for Moshiach. The Lord raised up a deliverer for them. Ehud, a left-handed Benjaminite, not a judge, a deliverer, because the text knows the title can be misread and wants the function visible. Ehud straps a cubit-long sword to his right thigh, gets an audience with the Moabite king Eglon, kills him alone in the king's private chamber, escapes, blows the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and leads an army that kills 10,000 Moabite soldiers at the Jordan crossings. The land rests for 80 years. That is a Shophet's work. Deborah, Judges 4:4-5. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm tree between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. The judicial function is genuinely here. Deborah held court. She heard cases. The English word isn't wrong in that moment, but the crisis arrives in the next verse. God commands Barak to take 10,000 men to battle, and Deborah delivers that command. Barak refuses to go unless she goes with him. Deborah goes to the battlefield. Judges 4:14. Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you? The palm tree is behind her. The valley is ahead." That is the Chauffet at the moment the word demands the most. And there is more in Deborah's story. After the battle, she and Barak sing what is often called the Song of Deborah, one of the oldest surviving pieces of Hebrew poetry. Judges 5. In that song, the shophetim are described as the ones who kept the roads open, who made it possible for Israel to function as a society after years of oppression. Judges 5:6-7 says, "In the days of Shamgar son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned. Travelers took to winding paths. Villagers in Israel would not fight. They held back until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose, a mother in Israel, a mother in Israel." That is how Deborah names her own Chauffet identity. Not a judge, a mother who arose. A rescuer who stood up when the roads themselves were too dangerous to walk. Gideon, Judges 6-8. The Midianite oppression. The angel calling a terrified man a mighty warrior. The fleece, wet then dry, confirming what Gideon still can't quite believe. The reduction from 32,000 soldiers to 300 by divine instruction. The torches inside clay jars, the ram's horns, the night attack, the Midianite camp consumed by its own confusion, the pursuit, the execution of the Midianite kings. Chauffet describes him. But every page shows a man whose entire purpose is to end the oppression, not adjudicate it, but break it. Jephthah, Judges 11:1. Introduced as a mighty warrior before Chauffet ever attaches to him. The elders of Gilead seek him out specifically for his military reputation. They need a fighter, not an arbitrator. They commission a warrior and call the result a Chauffet. Samson, the longest individual narrative in the book. His entire story is physical confrontation with Philistine power, the torched foxes, the jawbone of a donkey at Lehi, the gates of Gaza, the final collapse of the temple columns on 3,000 Philistines. Judges 16:31 calls him a Chauffet of 20 years. What 20 years of relentless collision with Philistine occupation looks like is exactly what those 4 chapters show you. Each one of these figures is introduced with a problem and a calling. The problem is always external, an enemy, an oppressor, a force that has been stripping Israel for years, and the calling always arrives before the person is ready. before they feel equipped, before the plan makes sense. Gideon still has questions when God tells him the army is too large. Deborah is already at the battlefield telling the general to move before the outcome is clear. The pattern says something about what a Shophet is at the most essential level. Not the person who waits until the situation is manageable. The person who goes when the situation is unmanageable. This is the Book of Rescuers. The English title has been pointing the wrong direction. Now the book's closing refrain takes on different weight. Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. 4 times across the final dark chapters, the text repeats this. It is an indictment of moral drift, of lawlessness, of the collapse of accountability to something larger than individual appetite. And it is exactly right as an indictment. But look at what the previous 20 chapters argued was the alternative. Not a better court system, not more judicial infrastructure. The alternative was a Shophet, someone who intervenes when the community is sliding, someone who rescues when the people are being pressed down by a force they cannot lift themselves, someone who goes. The entire book is one extended answer to one enduring question. When everything deteriorates, when the enemies are inside the territory, the harvest is stripped, the people have forgotten what they were made for. Who will be the Shophet? That question isn't sealed in 1100 BCE. It arrives in every generation wearing different clothing. The community drifts. The cost of the drift shows up eventually. And then the question surfaces. Who is the Shophet here? Who is the rescuer? Who will not wait for someone more qualified, more obviously appointed, more visibly equipped? The pattern in the book of Judges is a mirror, not just a history. And here's a detail that most readers completely miss because the English translation obscures it. In Judges 2:16, the text says, God raised up shophetim who saved the people from those who plundered them. The Hebrew word for plundered there is from the root shasas, which means to plunder, to strip, to spoil completely. The Midianites didn't inconvenience the Israelites. They stripped them. The Ammonites didn't compete with them. They crushed them. Judges 10:8 says the Ammonites shattered and crushed the Israelites that year, using a verb that means to crack something open under force. The crisis the Shophet enters isn't a civil dispute. It's a situation of systematic stripping of what people need to survive. And the Shophet's function is to stop the stripping. Not to arbitrate between the stripper and the stripped, to stop it. This is why the word matters pastorally, not just linguistically. When you read this book as a collection of legal administrators, you read it as history at a distance. Interesting, ancient, not directly applicable unless you work in a courthouse. When you read it as a collection of rescuers, the book becomes a pattern that recurs across all of human time. And the question it asks becomes urgent. Where is the stripping happening right now? Who is being systematically diminished, slowly robbed of what they need to survive? Their dignity, their security, their hope. And who is the Shophet? Who is the person positioned to go toward that and stop it? Think about the people the book actually gives you to represent this word. They are not heroic in the way that word usually flatters its subjects. Gideon is hiding in a winepress when he is called. He argues with the messenger. He asks for a wet fleece when the ground is dry, then a dry fleece when the ground is wet. 2 separate confirming signs because once wasn't enough. This is who God names a mighty warrior before the man has done a single mighty thing. Deborah leads a nation into a military campaign and has to accompany the general to get him to move. Jephthah is the illegitimate son of a prostitute, expelled from his home by his half-brothers, running a gang of outlaws in the wilderness before the elders come to him in desperation. Samson uses supernatural strength primarily to pursue women who are wrong for him and settle personal scores, and yet Philistine power diminishes because of him. None of them were ready. Most of them were wrong about something important. Jephthah's vow results in one of the most devastating scenes in the Hebrew Bible. Gideon's behavior after his military victory plants seeds that poison the next generation. Samson dies because he couldn't keep a secret from someone who'd tried 4 times already to use it against him. The shophetim of this book are not portraits of spiritual perfection. They are something more uncomfortable and more useful. Evidence that God uses the person who goes. Not always the person who is clean or prepared or certain, the person who goes. So here's where the word Shophet lands on your actual life. Not whether you feel qualified for what you sense you might be called toward. The Shophetim never felt qualified. Gideon literally hid. Not whether the timing seems right. The timing in Judges is never right. It is always crisis time. Always the moment when the wrong person going seems like the only option remaining. Not whether your plan makes complete sense. Gideon went forward in the dark with 300 people, a clay jar, and a torch. What the word seems to ask is simpler than qualifications and harder than strategy. Will you look away? or will you go? There is a situation in your life that surfaces when you're honest with yourself. A person under some form of oppression, visible or hidden, dramatic or quiet. A relationship that has slowly become a captivity for someone you care about. A community you are part of that has been drifting toward darkness for years, while everyone watches and waits for someone else to move first. And somewhere in you there is a recognition, not necessarily certain or confident, but persistent, that you might be the Shophet for that situation, that you might be the one who is supposed to go toward it. It doesn't mean you have all the answers. Gideon didn't. It doesn't mean you won't be afraid. Ehud walked into a foreign throne room alone with a hidden weapon. It doesn't mean the people you go toward will immediately appreciate the rescue. The Israelites cycled back into the same patterns the moment the pressure lifted, again and again, and the rescue was real anyway. The word Shophet asks you one question that cuts through all the hesitation. When the people around you are being plundered, when something is pressing them down and you can see it, will you look away? Or will you be the Shophet? And here is something worth sitting with. The book of Judges doesn't end with a victory. It ends with a civil war and an atrocity, and the refrain that everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. The Shophetim didn't ultimately fix Israel. Deliverance was real and temporary. The next crisis always came. And you might wonder, is it worth going then? If the rescue doesn't hold permanently, if the people drift back, if the deliverance only lasts as long as the Chauffet is alive, is going worth it? The book's answer, if you read its theology honestly, is yes, because the rescue was real while it lasted. The people who grew up under Gideon's 40 years of peace were real people with real lives shaped by that peace. The families who went to market on roads that Deborah made safe were real families. The deliverance was real even if it wasn't permanent. And the one who went, even if they never saw the lasting change they hoped for, was the Chauffet, the one who went. Drop your answer in the comments. I'm asking seriously, not for an abstract theological position, for your actual situation. What opened up for you when you heard the word as rescuer rather than judge? This channel is built on the conviction that the original word opens something the translation leaves closed, and your reflection on what that opening means for your specific life is more valuable than anything I could say about it at a distance. And if this kind of conversation is what you want more of, the original word, the weight the original carries, what gets compressed in translation and what opens back up when you go behind it, then subscribe now. This is what the channel exists to do. Every episode is one word the way the original author wrote it. In the next episode, we go back to the Greek. The word is hypomone. Your translation almost certainly renders it as patience or endurance. And when most readers hear those words, they picture someone sitting still, waiting quietly, bearing difficulty with a serene expression. The actual Greek word means something far more active and far more militant than that. Hypomone doesn't describe passive suffering. The ancient writers who used it knew it as something closer to defiant endurance under assault. That's next. The Hebrew title of this book is Shophetim. Not because ancient Israel needed better courtrooms, because they needed people who would go when going was the most costly and unreasonable thing imaginable. Your English Bible calls them judges. The original calls them what every broken situation in every generation has always needed. The ones who would not look away.